Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today we are joined by Siobhan Murphy, who is the Visual Thinking Strategies Programme Director at the University College of Cork. So thank you for joining us, Siobhan.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
No problem. So you're obviously in Ireland. Just tell me a bit about where you're from originally.
I'm sitting in Cork City right now, and I'm from a small town in North Cork called Newmarket.
Okay. And so talk about your upbringing then. So you're from there and you've been there ever since?
No, I spent many years away before coming back to Cork. But so I was brought up on a small farm, a 50-acre farm. I have 3 siblings, and I think I started getting really interested in the idea of thinking and how people think through my father. My father was born in 1904, and at 16, he went on this Cedric, the RMS Cedric, to the United States, and spent, I think in those days, it was 50 years after the famine and things were really tough. So they were reared tough, but even for a 16-year-old, that was a perilous journey to make in those days. And then I suppose he followed a kind of a westward immigration across the frontier to Oregon, and he was there for 8 years. Subsequent to that, he spent many years in the war, the Second World War. He was on Omaha Beach on D-Day. So when I was a child, oftentimes our night sleep was broken because of dreams that he would have. And other than that, he was a really lovely, pleasant person, a very calm, serene gentleman. And he would spend hours looking out the window and just thinking. And we would ask him as children what he was thinking about. And the answer was always the same. He would always laugh and say, "I couldn't be telling you that, baby." And so it got me starting thinking about what people were thinking very early on in my life, And the idea that you would think about nothing was, at the time, intelligence was linked to thinking and the kind of lofty thoughts you might have. So in my innocence, I thought of him as unexceptional for a long time. And then on one occasion, he revealed a story about the war, and he described the trenches. He was in the trenches for 2 years. So the concept that you wouldn't have any thought, having had the history that he had, was anathema, So on one occasion, he did talk about the war, and at that point, that was revealing for me, because I thought, oh God, he has very complex thoughts, and he has very deep thoughts and compassionate thoughts, and it changed my mind about him. But it set me off on a kind of a journey about thinking and how we have value, even if we're not intellectually intelligent. And of course, as you would know from your interaction with sports people, and there are multiple intelligences now, for instance, like bodily intelligence, musical intelligence, visual intelligence. So the idea that you are intelligent and that you have value, even if you don't have that intellectual capacity to think, was really something that I became very interested in early on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating, actually, because that's something which is, I was actually just speaking to a friend, but she's also a client of ours, and she's talking about her daughter, what she should be doing in terms of going to university, jobs, and all of those things. And we're so defined by academic achievement in a lot of things. But me as an employer, I think there's a lot of other areas of intelligence, however you define those things. So I think this area is really, really interesting. So in terms of that then, so what point, you were obviously a child when you were looking at this side, but like, how did that manifest into what you were looking at from like your growth and journey and education?
So I became a nurse. I dreamed of becoming a fashion designer, but in those days there was a channel, there was a track that people went down. And I think some people managed to escape from the track, but I didn't. So I followed my sister into nursing, and that was a fantastic thing for me to do. It gave me the opportunity to travel, but more than that, it gave me an eye. And I was trained by the nuns in Ireland, and they were very strict about observation. And even in the detail, God is in the detail, and the crease on the bedspread would have to be centered. And and the treatment of patients was amazing. The way people looked after people in those days. I'm going back 35 years, Andy, not but patients were really prioritized. Their emotions mightn't have been prioritized. The nuns were tough. It wasn't about that kind of love. It was that kind of love, but they really looked after patients, and they gave you an eye to. They taught you how to observe very carefully, and they taught, and I learned empathy and compassion through that life. So it was a fantastic training for me. So I spent 10 years in intensive care in different parts of the world. And after that, I suppose, why did I decide that I wanted to do something to improve how people thought, how people observed, empathy, compassion? I didn't see a lot of it when I was on the other side of the bed, to be honest with you. I didn't we all make mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes when I was nursing, mistakes that I carry with me, and that everybody who's involved in healthcare, you will always remember the mistake that, cost. So that's part of being human. But I suppose I wasn't really affected by it until I was on the other side of the bed, taking relatives in and out of hospital, and really seeing the impact of the lack of compassion, the lack of empathy, misdiagnosis. In America, in 2016, a report came out from Johns Hopkins University to say that medical error is the third biggest cause of death in the United States. Third. So medical error kills about 250,000 people in the United States per year. So now my experience was unfortunate. I had a run of unfortunate experiences, and that's not to say that healthcare workers are magnificent. They are magnificent. And especially in light of the COVID crisis that we've seen, we have a renewed respect for what people do and how much they give, and I gave and gave and gave as a healthcare practitioner. But I was we all have our blind spots, and even then I may have been blind to the little errors I was making that weren't reported back. So there's room for improvement when it comes to what people call transformative competencies. And these are the skills that I try to teach now through VTS.
So when you're doing that work then, at what point did you start thinking back to the interaction you had with your dad? How do you take that from those thoughts through to VTS becoming a thing?
Right. So I was in a privileged position in the university, in that my husband was, and I hate to be the wife of a thing, but my husband was the Dean of Medicine in the College of Medicine and Health at the time. So I think I had privileged access, I suppose, to the ear and the generosity of faculty. And at some point, I think that when you're in a position like that, that you have a responsibility as well. And I just wondered, what could I do to make a difference? And the first thing, so I knew that the answer had to be in the humanities, because harking back to the dream of being the designer, I had a kind of an artistic bent, and I loved doing art at school. I did it until my A levels. I wasn't very much good at it, but I liked it. And so I asked the faculty if there was a possibility of introducing an arts space. So we did that first. And in the course of the number of years that art space, and it's still up and running, the Jennings Gallery, we started looking for a program in the humanities that would improve particularly observation skills. And we came up with VTS. A lovely woman that I worked with at the time, Ruth Barker, discovered it. And she said, have a look at this. And it was like bingo. So it was, for me, it was the idea of improving thinking, improving observation through the medium of art. It was like a trifecta for me. It was a magic moment, I thought these are all the things that I really love coming together. So I approached the faculty again, and they were incredibly generous and open-minded, and thought that it would be worth a try. And that is how it happened. And it is through their hard work and enablement, and the fact that they embraced the idea, that we now have, over 500 students every year. So in every school of medicine and health, nursing, dentistry, physiotherapy, speech therapy, students take VTS.
Okay, so that's like an elective that kind of fits in there. They've got to do that. So was VTS a thing before then? Was that something that had been established prior and you just found it?
Yeah, I just found it. Yeah, VTS was a program that was developed in between Harvard University and MOMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was developed by the director of education at MOMA and a Harvard psychologist, Abigail Housen and Philip Yenawine, in the late 80s. And it was really in response to it was to try to get people to engage more with art at MOMA, and to develop a kind of a relationship with it, with what they were looking at, so that they could make meaning out of what they were looking at. Because the audience data at the time, in the studies that they did at MOMA, showed that the amount of information that was retained by audience after they left MOMA was very little. So curators, very experienced, wonderful curators, that took groups around the museum, and would talk about different works of art in a study called the Recall Study. Later, they discovered that they remembered very little about what they were told, and what they remembered was kind of just idiosyncratic, bits of information here and there.
Yeah. So for that then, so when you were looking at bringing this in, what was the purpose of it? Was it to help people understand more and retain more information from the medical courses they're on, or was it from a bigger picture in terms of being able to develop these people into more of just a more rounded person?
Honestly, at the very beginning, our priority was to improve observation. And there was a lot of data, and there is a lot of data now that VTS, it's evidence-based. It does improve observation skills from a lot of universities, particularly in North America. So that was our primary objective. But very quickly into it, we discovered that while it's not a panacea for everything, it does much more than improve observation skills. So observation is a a foundational skill of critical thinking. So critical thinking is a word that's bandied around a lot, Andy, and people kind of think, well, what is that, you know? So it's just a thinking skill. And going back to observation, it's, you know, Sherlock Holmes comes into my mind. You know, you see Watson, but you don't observe. And seeing is different to observing. And in the College of Medicine and Health, students are taught how to recognize normal from abnormal, but they're not really taught the actual skill of careful looking in itself.
Yeah.
So observation was our first priority, but very quickly we started understanding that we're really working on thinking skills, and observation is fundamental to thinking. So if I could explain thinking skills, we think in two different ways. We kind of think with our gut and we think with our brain. So the thinking that we do with our gut is very fast, it's very automatic. We don't put much effort into that. It's like driving a car to work. The car kind of drives itself. It's a kind of a highly emotional way of thinking. It's it's high risk. It carries a high risk for error. The other kind of thinking is more slow. It's not automatic. It's high effort, and it's there's less risk of error. So the error part of it, if I could describe it as an iceberg, Freud, you know, that psychologist Freud, he described our minds to an iceberg. And if you can imagine, the tip of the iceberg is about 5% of the iceberg, and there's 95% underneath it. And the 5% is the thinking, the thinking that's in our awareness. And underneath the water is all our unconscious, the thinking that's in our unconscious. So the beliefs and the bias and all the stuff that's the stuff that's lurking underneath the water really shapes and forms our conscious thinking, if that makes sense.
No,
And
it
it's
does. It does. I mean, that's something, because I love all these self-development books and so on in this area. So I've read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, and that's talking about these exact concepts of gut thinking, but then also that more informed, getting all the information. So yeah, no, I find it all very interesting. Then, could you just give an example of how you might, what is a practical example of what that might include in the VCS training?
Yeah, sure. Just before I go on, there's nothing the matter, Andy, with the automatic gut, fast thinking. There's nothing the matter with it. It's really important, and it's important in healthcare, because you would get nothing done if you didn't work through pattern recognition and that fast kind of, you just know. If you've seen something often enough, you know that's it. If it looks like a dog, if it barks like a dog, if it walks like a dog, it's probably a dog. But then what if it looks like a dog, it walks like a dog, but it's a hyena? What if it's not a dog? That's when you need to toggle between the fast thinking and the slow thinking. And that's what we train people to do in VTS. Now, you asked for an example. Can you ask me the question again?
Yeah, well, just to comment on that. I mean, I definitely appreciate you go with your instinct. Like, we work with a lot of therapists and clinicians, and they will do an initial assessment and they'll have their own ideas. Now, we work with diagnostic ultrasound as well, and a lot of the time, once you've identified what you think it is, you'll do a scan and it shows it maybe isn't that, or it's something else. So it's a combination, isn't it, of both your experience, instinct, as well as the data that you've got in front of you. So yeah, no, I find it really fascinating, all of that. But yeah, so what I asked for was just trying to give some more ideas of how you actually, what would be part of the course, what is something that's going to help improve an observation skill, for example.
Okay, so all of these skills, these competencies, thinking, communication, empathy, teamwork, all of that, we improve them through VTS, which is a looking at art program. So we, through conversation, looking at a work of art, firstly, later on we move to other kinds of images and then onto other content, different things we look at. But through conversation, looking at a work of art, it's simple enough, really. We through the discussion, that is how observation is taught. Is that your question?
Yeah, so it's just trying to get like what would be part of like, the program that you do. How does that? Well, what actually is it? Like, what do they do? Is it talking through the art and interpreting things? Like more tangible stuff would be great.
It's a conversation, basically, Andy, and we start with a group of people. It's and the first thing we ask them is to take a moment's silence and look at the work of art. And silence is really important. Silence is something that's really required for thinking about anything. And you know, a lot of stuff passes us by. We're bombarded now by so much visual information that if we want to think about something seriously and gain something by the thinking, we have to stop and we have to be silent, and that's really important. And it's something that people aren't very used to doing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we ask them, what's going on in this picture? If you ask somebody what's going on in this picture, it's a different question to asking them, what do you see in this picture? Can you see how?
Yeah. So you're trying to interpret what's actually happening and the reasons for that, rather than just the physical image.
That's it. Because if you ask the other question, you'll get an inventory. So we're looking for a deeper form of meaning making. And that question is important because people love storytelling. And it kind of opens the conversation, and it's sort of, the phrasing suggests that there is something going on in the picture. And it asks them to begin with their natural inclination to tell a story. So that's the first question. The second question that we ask in response to, maybe if we hear an assumption, we'll say, what do you see that makes you say that the man might be drunk? Or that, what do you see that makes you say that it's a boy? So, or it's a girl. And this calling for evidence is really, really important. It kind of drives a more sophisticated way of meaning making, and just finding evidence in the image supports the skill of fact-based reasoning. And that's really important in healthcare. It's really important in anything at all, you know, but especially in healthcare. So that question is asked whenever you hear an inference or an assumption. And, you know, to give a very simple example, children before COVID, before the long hair thing started coming in COVID, if you showed a picture to a child of a man with long hair, they would automatically assume it was a girl. That's a very basic image now, you know. But to call out that assumption, say, what do you see that makes you say it might be a girl? So they have to look a little more carefully, and then they might discover, oh well, he is wearing a trousers, and he is not that. That's another assumption, but you know, there may be other clues to suggest that actually it's not a girl.
Yeah.
So that is the second question. And the third question that we ask is, what more can we find? And what more can we find encourages people to just keep on going, to keep drilling down. It's a very direct way of pushing beyond people's kind of early impressions, and it has the kind of effect of making the conversation kind of richer and more complete. And the repetition of that question long term promotes perseverance. And I kind of find that Sometimes, especially with students, people are uncomfortable with that question because they might have said a lot already about their early impressions. And then you ask the question and you can feel people shifting in their seats and thinking, God, like we've said it all, you know? But then if you just let it sit for a while, it's like, you know, that liminal space, liminal is Latin for threshold. So it's like crossing from the conscious of the iceberg. Now we're going under the water. We're going down, we're diving down deeply into almost the unconscious. And people are so resourceful. They have so much information that just needs to be brought out. And it's a bit like, so that space is a very generative space. A lot of ideas come out of that silence. And I don't know if you have any interest in jazz, but Miles Davis said, play through it. You know, the improv of jazz where, you know, now they have to make it all up. And Miles Davis talked about that awkwardness, you know, and he just said, play through it. So that's what we're doing in VTS. We're allowing them to sit with a bit of discomfort to bring out the real richness of the interpretation.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think it's got a lot of transferable things for this as well. Because like we do this when we're speaking to a customer and say we're trying to identify why they want to invest in technology or something like that. And they'll go reasons why they can't do it. And you kind of need to keep asking why, basically trying to get to what is the real reason or what's that real thing that they're trying to address. So I think it's really trying to get people to think about these things because sometimes they're not sure of what the actual reason is for this thing, but sometimes that is an uncomfortable question to keep asking.
Yeah.
It's not something, whether it's considered rude or it's private or imposing on them. So no, I think it's really fascinating that area, and it's again be applicable to a number of different areas.
I'm really thrilled to hear that you keep asking the why.
Yeah,
Really thrilled. And it's also about how you ask the why, isn't it? You know, it's so that you're not being confrontational, you're being more, it's more inquiry based, and that feeds into, kind of segues into the idea of VTS helping communication as well, you know,
yeah,
because how we communicate is everything. The International Joint Commission on uh, Health and Safety in 2007, and ever since 2007, said that communication is um, the root cause of over half the adverse events in hospitals, a lack of communication. So they've been pushing this idea of communication for quite a while. And communication is really, it's not just about talking, and it's, you know, it's not just about language literacy, you know, how clever you are in saying things. It's about questioning, and it's about listening. And listening is fierce important when you ask the question why. You know, it's really important to kind of, to really listen, to the, you know, to the answer. And if you have an intention to kind of understand where they're coming from, that's an art that requires attention over talent and people over self, really.
mm,
So I think those questions, any question that provokes people to go deeper and deeper is really important. And a lot of it is about the way you say it, you know, and allowing people to listen to themselves. There's a woman called Rachel Naomi Riemann. She's a professor in the University of California, San Francisco. She's an author. She's written some amazing stuff, and she says listening creates a holy silence. And if you allow, um, I'm not paraphrasing it properly, but if the more you allow people, the more you listen to people, the more you enable them to hear themselves, often for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it is genuinely a huge interest for me for all of this. So, is it something then? So you're using it within the medical world currently, but is it something that you can see being applied just in general life for people then?
Yeah, well, in America, it started off being applied in school in school settings, in primary school settings, and they're probably well over are coming up to 2 million children in North America now that have taken a VTS curriculum as part of their school studies, which is amazing, you know. And there are two organizations in America that hold the stewardship of VTS now. So the program was devised between Harvard and MOMA, and Abigail Housen and Philip Yenawine set up a company called Visual Understanding in Education in those years that has now disbanded. And now there is VTS.org, VTShome.org, if anybody would like to look that site up, or watershed.ed. And they hold the stewardship of VTS, but they've branched out well beyond primary schools now into organizational development and third level education development and a lot of other contexts. So anywhere that there is a need to improve human competency and skills of thinking, creative thinking. So creative thinking isn't about arts and crafts. It's about imagination and being able to brainstorm and come up with new ideas and generate new ideas. That kind of skill, communication, teamwork, anywhere there's a need to develop teamwork. And you know, this idea of, I suppose, in organizations, this willingness to kind of participate in group thinking and discussion. And teamwork is huge because 50%, teamwork has increased probably about 50% in the last 20 years. And 2/3 of everybody's day now is spent communicating and collaborating with peers. And I read a study in 2019 where, despite the fact that, you know, you hear about high performing teams, only 27% of teams are actually high performing. So, you know, that cult idea of the high performing team is a bit of a misnomer because it takes a lot of effort to make a team gel and work effectively together. And the cost of a team not working well together costs, you know, billions of dollars. There's an Australian study that was done quite recently, and they estimated the cost of poor team performance across a range of industries to be in the region of 6 billion in that particular year. So anywhere that teamwork is important, anywhere that, you know, empathy, compassion, understanding is important, VTS is a great tool to improve those competencies. It's not the only tool. There are a lot of other tools out there that work on competency and these skills, these human skills. And by the way, these are not new skills. We've always had these skills. We've just let them slip a bit because of the world that we now live in.
Yeah. And what is your vision for this then? What are you hoping to do with VCS?
Personally, I'm working with VTS all the time, and a group of faculty members at the university and myself we're now offering VTS experiences to people outside of the university just by popular demand. You know, people keep asking, how can we get experience of VTS? How can we sit in on a discussion? How can we get trained in VTS? And we work with colleagues internationally, both in America, in the Netherlands, VTS Netherlands. And there are quite a few places now that people can get VTS experience or training in. And that's my dream, you know. I just, I dream of improving people's competencies so we are better skilled to navigate the world we live in and the future that's in front of us, you know, because I think it's going to be an exciting future. It has a lot of potential difficulties for people. And I think we really need to equip ourselves with, for me personally, tech skills, digital skills, and human skills. And these are the human skills that I really, really love talking about.
No, definitely. I think it's really interesting. So it's our team meeting next week. So I'm going to do some research beforehand, and maybe I'll introduce some of these things. So for people who are looking for more information on this, what would you recommend as a good starting point to expose themselves to VTS?
I would say it's a lovely thing to join a conversation, to sit in with a group of people and have a facilitator facilitate a conversation, because you can be part of a group. And there is evidence that to show that if you have 10 hours of VTS conversations, that you will improve your critical thinking skills, and your observation skills, and that you will see lasting long-term effect as a result of that. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston did a study a number of years ago, a longitudinal study, to prove that the effect that was seen, you know, years earlier did last. So we don't have any data for any less than 10 hours. That's not to say that if you participate in 5 discussions that there will be an impact. I'm sure there will, but we have no evidence to say that it's going to last. But we do if you've had 10 hours. So that's the first thing. You could sit in on a VTS discussion and improve your own skills through talking about art. We have, in the course of the conversation or the discussion is always led by a facilitator. We call them facilitators because they're not teachers, you know, and there's, you know, in this, there's this culture of telling, you know, in teaching, imparting information, telling people information, but asking gets kind of short shrift. So facilitators, the people who moderate or host a conversation, we just ask questions. We don't tell, I don't have any background in art, you know, so so I'm not, the objective is not to teach anybody about artwork or art content. That's not the objective, really. The objective is more about slow looking, listening, meaning making. Yeah, so you could also learn how to become a facilitator. So, you know, there are courses that are offered to train people to actually become that person.
Oh, no, that sounds good. Well, you say in terms of websites, so vts.org is the one that you mentioned. Is that a good starting place?
vtshome.org, watershed.ed, vtsireland.org, which is us, VTS Netherlands, if you're in the Netherlands. Yeah, and I think the Thinking Eye is a website in London.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I found this area really, really fascinating. So I've enjoyed hearing more about it. So I'm definitely going to be going away and looking at some of this. And I think we do it to some extent, but I'd never heard of VTS before. Maeve kindly introduced you to me. So yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. So I think thank you very much for sharing all of this information. It'd be great to come back at some point and and find out where you're up to on things. And yeah, I'll definitely be chasing you up for more of this info. But if you're happy, I'll include your information on this, and so people can get in touch with you directly. But other than that, I really appreciate your time. So thank you for joining.
Delighted to talk to you. Thanks, Andy.
No problem. Thank you.